I'm going to start today by mentioning that my wife Renee does not believe in coincidences. And the skeptic that I am, I just saw something pop up on my Facebook feed this morning, and I don't think it was sent by John or Philip or any of the Facebook guys that I see posting. But it says that they found a brown diamond in Brazil. And this brown diamond just means it's a diamond that was formed under intense pressure. It's a natural diamond. It contains a impurity, and they call this ringwoodite for some reason. And it turns out that 1.5% of this little diamond that they found is water. And you remember me telling you last week that we don't know where all the water would have gone if there was a global flood? Well, it turns out that the quote on this says it confirms predictions from high-pressure laboratory experiments that a water reservoir comparable in size to all the oceans on Earth is hidden deep in the Earth's mantle over 400 miles below the surface of the Earth. Now, that doesn't mean anything, but it's real interesting. It doesn't mean anything yet, but it just shows that we can always be surprised. And so I may change my mind about what I say about that. And that leads me to another point that I wanted to make today is we hold Scripture, and I hold Scripture high above all else in terms of truth. Because Scripture is not intended, I would suggest that Scripture is not intended as a science textbook. It's intended as a user's guide for human beings. And insofar that Scripture aligns with what science says, then we can feel that we're grateful that we understand what's in God's message in the depth of His knowledge and creation. Where it doesn't fit, we really need to take a look at what we've come to understand and try to reconcile that. Right now there are people who will cross you off the list of Christian fellowship if you are a young earth creationist, or if you're an evolutionist, or a theistic evolutionist. And what I've tried to show so far is that Scripture does not say how God did everything. It says what He did. And to a lot of extent, it says why He did it. And I think, like the natural theologists that I discussed last week, that it's part of our privilege as Christians to look on God's creation and look at the laws that He made to see how those are integrated with His Word. So today, we're going to continue with these. These are all the check boxes. The gray ones are the ones that we've talked about a little bit. I've squeezed in a couple, like the existence of God, that y'all didn't say you were terribly interested in. But that was the very first thing we talked about. In order to believe anything about Scripture and to be an apologist, you really need to know how to defend the fact that there is a God. We talked about religion and science, how there's supposed conflicts. We talked about the creation and the origin of the universe. We talked about the origin and the age of the earth last week. And there's still a lot of question marks with that. But we do know that Scripture says God created the earth, the heavens and the earth, and everything in it. So this week, we're going to talk about life. I wanted to talk about the origin of life and the origin of man at the same time, but that is like way too complicated to cover in 30 minutes. And so I'm just going to try to get the spark going this morning. So as I hope to do, we always want to focus on Scripture first and find out what it says. And on this topic, what it says about the origin. So the first thing we find in Genesis is, again in the first chapter, starting with verse 12. And the earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, trees bearing fruit, seed in them after their kind. And God saw that it was good, evening and morning, the third day. So on the third day, we see things that are observable, as we do in science, that plants appeared, plants reproduce, yielding seed after their kind, Trees bear fruit with seeds after their kind. So we talk about reproduction of life, and that life was implied, it was implied that life was intended to continue. We also see, continuing in Genesis, that God talked about the lights in the expanse of heaven on the fourth day. And there he said, let there be lights in the expanse of heavens to separate the day from the night. Let them be for seasons, for days and years, and for signs. Let them be for lights, and let them be for lights, so that they can give light on the earth. God made two great lights, a greater light to govern the day, which we know is the sun, and the lesser light to govern the night, or the moon. And he made the stars also. So that last little phrase puts God's creation way out of bounds of the earth. And we kind of know how, nowadays how big that is. And he placed them in the expanse of the heavens to also give light to the earth. And again, you can interpret that how you want, but giving light also means giving knowledge and giving understanding. So he's not an apologist. So the lights govern the day and the night to separate the light from the darkness for times and seasons, and so forth. There was a fourth day. So continuing on in Genesis, let the water teem with swarms of living creatures. Let birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the heavens. God created the great sea monsters or sea creatures. Every living creature that moves. That sea monsters is Leviathan, by the way. That's where they get that word Leviathan. And let the waters swarm, with which the waters swarmed after their kind, every winged bird after its kind, and God saw it was good. Again, animals and birds and creatures in the sea all reproduce after their kind. But God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, fill the waters in the seas, let the birds multiply on the earth. And there was evening and morning, a fifth day. And finally, in Genesis 26, let us make man in our image. You see that first reference to the Trinity there, let us, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. And God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So what do you think that means, in God's image? I can tell you where I grew up, they had sort of a logical syllogism where they used that verse to prove that God looks like us and that God was a man. But I think that's a literal interpretation that goes in the wrong direction even with that. What do you think creating man in God's image means?
I think it means what God wanted him to be.
That he created man with intent. And so what is that image? What image does God have that we also share? Holy. We're set apart for holiness. Any other ideas? Eternal?
I think it means that we are created capable of reflecting at least some of God's characteristics.
Mm-hmm. Which are? Righteousness.
Loving.
Love. Forgiveness. Are all those things scientifically measurable?
We're also able to, like we have intellect, so we're able to think, we're able to make decisions and make choices. We're able to create and make things. Like there's a lot of things that we have in our likeness.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the really sad part is that you see that in that verse it says, let us make man in our image. But then later when you're reading about Adam, when he has a son, it's like he had a son in his image. So it's like we went from being in God's image, and then all of a sudden we went from being into the image of man.
So we kind of lost some of that image, and that's part of the idea of the fall. Interesting. It's a good comment. And so God blessed the man and the woman. He said, be fruitful and multiply, as with all the other creatures. rule over the fish of the sea and every living thing. So man has been established at the top of the food chain, so to speak. But again, with power comes responsibility. So like God, man is responsible for being in the sense that he rules over his creation. I would suggest that man is responsible for being a good steward over God's creation as well. To every beast of the earth and everything that moves on the earth which has life, I've given every green plant for food. So God says that he's made all of this for benefit of man and for his creation. And God saw all that he's made and pronounced it good. So there was evening and morning the sixth day. So what does pronouncing it good?
Before
Yes,
you
ma'am.
ask that, I have a question. When it says specifically that God gave us the plants that yield seeds and the fruit which yield seeds for us to eat, what about the foods that man is making that no longer have seeds, like seedless watermelon or seedless grapes? What does that do for your body or your spirit? I mean, does it do anything?
I think the point was that it was not to say that you must eat, this is my opinion, that you must eat food with seeds. I think it's the point that God has created everything to be able to multiply and, in a nutshell, become an ecosystem that is self-sustaining.
But if a food doesn't bear a seed, it's devoid of life, right?
Not necessarily. Would you say that if you were sterile and you couldn't have children, that you were devoid of life?
But we have a spirit. Food does not have a spirit. Food was given to us to feed the spirit, and to feed the body, which encompasses the spirit.
Again, I'm not sure that it says anything about whether it has seeds or not. Any of you have opinions about that?
Well, I think it's a fascinating question, definitely.
Yeah.
God has also given us minds where we can think, and certainly we can run tests on these types of foods, seedless watermelons versus watermelons with seeds, to see what is the intrinsic difference between the two. But God did later give us meat to eat as well.
I mean,
I couldn't answer her
yeah,
question one way or the other.
there are people that feel that we should use Scripture as sort of a pattern of how to do things, and we can infer things from that pattern. And that if God says something about a situation being good, that we should only do that and nothing else. And there's sort of an argument from silence going there if you talk about it. If it doesn't say we can't do this, does that mean it's forbidden? And in general, I also feel, because we have the image of God and that God's given us a mind to think, that we're not given direct guidance on everything. We kind of have to figure it out by general principles. And so if there's something that's good for us, if food is good for us without seeds and we thrive on it and so forth,
But if man
I don't see a prohibition.
is eating food without seeds, does that mean that they're playing God because they're trying to reproduce something that God made perfect?
That's actually a good question, and I'd like to talk about that in another episode. When does man play God? Do we play God by choosing the sex of our children? Do we play God by trying to create life in a test tube? Those are big questions. And do we have that right? That's a good question. Anyway.
If nothing else, make a really good book or paper.
Well, I mean, you
Seriously.
kind of get into that with basically every food that any of us eat these days is not the way it originally was.
Right.
Right.
Look at kale, cauliflower, broccoli, etc. Those are all from the same plant that we selectively bred over generations to express different parts that we wanted to basically eat, right? So, as long as it... Trying to say, just because it doesn't produce seeds, or if it produces seeds, it's exactly what was created in Genesis, that's not true, essentially, because humans have been in charge of the earth for thousands and thousands of years, right? And we've been changing things, doing things, experimenting with stuff, trying out different ways. I mean, look at all the different breeds of cattle they are. That's not the way they started out. We selectively bred them to serve that purpose, right? Same thing with kind of anything else. It was
Yeah.
We need to serve a purpose, and that's what we're going to do. Does that
That's
help it all make sense? Put some color
Yeah.
on
I
it.
think, Scott, in fairness to the question, and I would have to argue, there's just not enough information from this particular context to make a decision one way or
Right.
another on that particular issue from that passage. There's just not enough data. So, might be elsewhere, but that particular
Yeah.
passage is just not enough.
in general, I think Scripture says that it's a good thing to try to understand what God has made for us and what He's provided from us from the beginning. And the closer we can get to that, it seems like a better thing. But again, the opposite isn't necessarily true. That if we get far away from that in some sense, we have to make a judgment whether it's good or bad.
Interestingly, God does, shortly after this, put man over the animals in the garden.
Uh-huh.
So, I mean,
So we're delegated some responsibility there. Yes, Bruce.
Go back to that last slide.
Do I have to?
When I look at verse 28 there at the top, God blessed them, and God said to them, Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and then rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over every living thing that moves on the earth. I think that little verse right there just proves to me that that's impossible that there's such a thing as evolution, because we still have apes here on Earth, but apes have never ruled over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky like man does. It just doesn't happen.
I think the question of when we begin to play God is an interesting one, because, at what point are we using the mental resources and intelligence that God's given us to improve foods or whatever, and at what point are we actually trying to take over?
And I will suggest that a good way to start with that question is the result good or evil? Okay, so how did life really begin? And I'm going to zoom through this because you can see we've spent quite a bit of time on that last
By the way,
question.
Scott, don't feel bad if you don't get through this. We got plenty of time.
Okay.
You need to do part 1, part 2.
Okay, fair enough.
You're good.
Okay.
Do whatever you need to do.
A creationist, and I'm going to use a capital C for creation. A creationist is one that believes that God created everything specially in a literal 24-hour day, exactly as it appears today, and there haven't been many changes. That's the most extreme end of the creation scale. And again, creationists are Christians, theistic evolutionists are Christians. It's just a matter of where they are convinced, somewhere in between maybe. I'm not going to say that one or the other is right. I just want you to know what these issues are. Creationist argument is pretty simple. God created something, poof, it's there. Nothing wrong with that idea. But not much to discuss after that. On the other hand, a purely naturalistic idea is uncertain and it's flawed. And I will say that it's flawed because it doesn't have the explanatory power that it needs for those of us who are skeptics and are curious to be satisfied with the answer. And okay, naturalistic ideas means that there's nothing else than nature that's created it. As Carl Sagan said last week, this is it. This is all we have. We're all by ourselves, and it's up to us to save ourselves by our bootstraps. And nature is big, and it's mean, and it's mindless, and it's not good or evil, but it's terrible. It's terrifying. And so there are people that have a worldview called naturalism or scientific materialism that believes there can't be anything that is supernatural or anything that is metaphysical. All that is just stuff for poets and artists and religious people. And there's no place for it in science. So, but I'll suggest to you that naturalistic ideas don't explain everything. They certainly don't explain the why.
Not to our understanding, at least.
Not to our understanding yet. And they change, which is good. They should change. There's an idea called progressive creation, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about why this is a bad idea. It used to be thought, and this is based on the fossil record, if we look in fossils, we find out that there are layers where there are a lot of a certain kind of creatures, reptiles or amphibians or whatever, and then in layers below that there are different kinds, and then they look for transitional species that show a gradual difference between one kind and the other kind. And creationists don't believe those ever existed because they believe that God created every kind specifically, individually. But that's not a good compromise because it doesn't make anybody happy intellectually. Number one is it challenges a lot of fundamental ideas about evolution, and also the fact that anything that happens besides special creation kind of offends creationists. So we kind of get into the situation where you see the donkey with 2 of his feet on one side of the fence and 2 of his feet on the other.
Truth might not make anybody happy.
Yeah, that's right. That's true. And that's a good point. I do want to say that I'm not presenting any of this as truth or that it'll make you happy. I'm ready to be called a heretic, but so a quick history lesson. People used to think that all life appeared spontaneously, and Louis Pasteur finally figured out if you put a piece of rotten meat and you put a cover over it, flies won't appear out of nowhere. It's just that we didn't see that process happening where a fly would land on a piece of rotten meat, lay eggs, and then other flies would come out. For a long time, people used to think that was the way it happened. And he figured out that it didn't happen that way. Stanley Miller, and I think I mentioned him earlier, he said that we can infer that the Earth had a certain number of chemicals on it, and that just being in the presence of each other, all mixed together, we should be able to create things like amino acids, which are building blocks of life. And by zapping electricity into this mixture of everything, life should create itself. Well, it didn't. And it turns out it's a lot more complicated than that. But the idea of trying to set up conditions for early life is still going on. There's some real interesting videos, and I'll try to post a link to them on Facebook if you're a Facebooker, about how people have done that. And the most interesting version of that I saw was a Nova episode where Neil deGrasse said, "How does life begin?" And it goes to a kitchen, and he shows somebody trying to bake a pastry, a French pastry. And they put all these ingredients together and they mix them all up and throw them in the oven. And it doesn't turn out like the French pastry. Well, why is that? Well, he finds out, you have to pre-cook it. You have to know something about the recipe. And there's the rub. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So, for all the time that I was going to school, this is what I was taught about how life began. And from primordial soup, there was a bunch of things and elements, and given long enough time and millions of molecules floating around, something's bound to happen that would create life.
Come here. There's something I want to show you. You see this? This is you. I'm serious. Right here. Life is about to form on this planet for the very first time. A group of amino acids are about to combine to form the first protein. The building blocks of what you call life. Strange, isn't it? Everything you know, your entire civilization, it all begins right here in this little pond of goo.
Thank you, Scott. That made my day.
Isn't that awesome? So, a couple of terms here. Biogenesis. What does that mean? Life from life. Yeah, life from life, as opposed to abiogenesis or abiogenesis, which is life from non-life. We see this all the time. We have yet to see this. And then there's the E word. When I first put this slide presentation together, I made a big deal out of drawing a distinction between microevolution and macroevolution. And I'm not going to do that anymore today. I'm just going to say that those are two arguments that describe how life came about. Evolution is all about variation in a species that passing on inheritable changes or mutations. And some of those changes are beneficial, some of them are destructive. The beneficial ones get passed on to the offspring of that species and become part of that genome, therefore making it fitter for survival. So that's where you get survival of the fittest. That was an idea came up with a long time ago, Charles Darwin. Pretty life-changing idea. And the power in that, as I mentioned last week, was that it excluded a role for God in its special creation. So it could explain life's complexity without resorting to a strictly supernatural cause, which made certain people happy and other people very unhappy. It doesn't address origins. Some people would say that it does, but there's something about that first thing, that primordial goo, the moment when life first started. What did that take? I drew a distinction between micro and macroevolution. Darwin saw that in the beaks of finches that had evolved separately on separate islands. And he found out that these were actually different species, that they had somehow separated from each other enough. And then also that moths that had different coloring, these moths with the dark colors could actually sit on dark trees and be not eaten by the birds, while as the white moths would sit on the trees and the birds would eat them, and vice versa. In London, where all the buildings were sooty, the black moths would live longer because they would be disguised. So anyway, all of those were very interesting, and those are easily explainable by stepwise gradual changes over a period of time and selection of the fittest. And you could actually, things like that, you can actually observe, and especially in bacteria, which reproduce very quickly. We talk about MRSA and all these resistant diseases. They have actually evolved before our eyes to develop survival aspects that are really hard to fight, and they weren't there 50 years ago. Now, macroevolution is kind of where biblical folks get kind of wrapped up about it, which is, they call it organic evolution or molecule to man, that there's basically no intervention by God from the very beginning of creation. And it jumps from species to species. Years ago, this used to be kind of a pretty big deal, and there was a lot of, there's actually another NOVA episode in 2011 about intelligent design that we'll talk about here in a minute. So the evidence for macroevolution is that there are, in embryology, creatures look very similar when they're, embryos. They don't differentiate into different kinds of animals until after they're grown for quite a while in the wombs, particularly for mammals, that is. Comparative anatomy, whales have fins, but they look more like feet than they do about fish fins, so they figure whales evolved from mammals. That kind of body shape and structure comparison. Vestigial organs, things like the so-called human tail, which I don't think anybody believes if we have a tail. If we once had a tail, is there any of that left? Genetic comparisons, they can now analyze genomes of creatures with amazing speed and find out where we look a lot alike. And did you know that humans share, I think, 82% of the same genes as a banana? Okay, so we share maybe 98% with chimpanzees, but we share 80-something% with a banana.
So that means we don't have to use much potassium.
Yeah, exactly. There you go.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
So it may or may not say something, but they can calculate the relationships between different species, and that seems pretty reliable. By looking at the genome. So, again, there used to be these gaps and missing links. We already talked about that. This is kind of a big deal that I haven't read anything that most people miss it, is what we call undirected complexity. How can something gain more information as it evolves? You know, that evolution is variation and natural selection based on variation. So where does that variation come to start with? What does natural selection act upon? You know, where does that first initial characteristic appear, and how does it appear as a informational attribute to that item, to that species? And then finally, natural selection doesn't explain good and evil, conscience, self-sacrifice, altruism, and that's been sort of an argument, which is basically the moral argument for the existence of God. Is there's a lot of writing that's been done by atheist writers about how, you know, we do things that are altruistic to help our species survive, and that we've figured out how to behave in groups, and somehow that's gotten genetically encoded. They don't explain how. But to me, I still have a problem with that. Be interested in anybody who has some good articles posted on how we could evolve a moral sensibility. How do we all know that it's wrong to kill babies? You know, what survival advantage would that give us? That's not part of passing information on. Anyway.
Part of the argument with those things is usually it's even if it's not your kid, if it's your cousin's kid or something, you're more closely related to that kid, so its survival is somewhat. The argument goes is that its survival has some of your genes, so its survival is in part kind of your survival. So that's why you'll have like family groups that look after each other, and then you also you extrapolate that out to a species level, whereas okay, well my species, my city, my whatever. Once you start forming societies, keeps propagating.
Mm-hmm. Although the problem is that statistically that doesn't work out, because most people kill members of their own families, and they have for ages, and so there's some other challenges to that are very interesting discussion.
But that's why when you're talking about like species, and you'll be like, well, why did this school of fish look after these when they're not just it's
I got you.
It's stuff like that.
And it seems like it's a big game changer for us to have a conscience and to be self-aware and all of that other stuff as well. And they could say that for animals, God has created them that way and created a system. Again, there's a lot of philosophical variance. And there's some bad ones too. During World War II, Hitler took this idea of survival of the fittest to the extreme and used it as an excuse to eliminate disabled people. He did that before he started eliminating Jews. And in fact, Virginia actually did that in the United States. I don't know about how many people know about the Bucks, Carrie and Emma Buck. They were actually sterilized because they were deemed by a judge to be not intelligent enough or not fit. Mentally invalid. And these are horrible outcomes if you don't have any kind of a moral compass guiding those kind of decisions.
Didn't the Nazis call it life undeserving of life or something like that with the phrase?
Sure. They believed that anything that wasn't moving towards their ideal Aryan race, which again was a perversion, I think, of the evolutionary idea, was they wanted to create a superior evolutionary race, and they basically arbitrarily chose anybody they didn't feel matched that.
Yeah, no, eugenics was a big thing, and Hitler actually got that from the U.S.
Yeah. So evolution in and of itself fails to account, I would say, for initial conditions of life. It doesn't explain complex information. Creationism, on the other hand, fails to reconcile biblical accounts with facts, with scientific facts. It needs to explain for genetic information. It has to explain the need for genetic information and adaptation. Otherwise, why would God have made those mechanisms, even from the creationist standpoint of view? Why would God have created evolutionary mechanisms if he never intended to use them? This is actually something that Darwin said. He understood the problem.
Can you just you read it?
Okay?
Or the,
To suppose that the eye, with all of its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, could have been formed by natural selection, it seems, I confess, absurd in the highest degree. Now, Richard Dawkins wrote an entire book about that quote, basically explaining how that could happen in stepwise fashion, called Climbing Mount Improbable. It's actually a really good book, and it presented his point of view really well. It didn't convince me, but it's more complicated than it seems from a soundbite. So what else is there? This is a topic that I used to talk a lot about, and I got really excited about it when it first came out in the mid-90s, I think it was. A gentleman named Michael Behe and William Dembski wrote a book about William Dembski wrote a book about intelligent design. Michael Behe wrote a book called Darwin's Black Box. Basically, Behe's thesis was that Darwin didn't know anything about molecular machines at the time, and that we can look at biology and at life and see things that probably could not have been made unless there was something or somebody intelligent directing their design. Now, the problem they got into is probably back in 2009, 2011, they actually got sent to court. These guys, or their organization, Discovery Institute, got sent to court and were accused of the Second Amendment violation of establishment of religion, because they were able to prove that these guys took this book that was being proposed as use. It's called Pandas and something, anyway, I can't remember the name of it, but it got proposed as a use for a textbook in a class in North Carolina. Anyway, they proved that they had tried to teach creationism, and that they changed the word creationism to intelligent design. And so they got their hands spanked, and a bunch of people got fired, and they replaced the school board and all that. And so everything's kind of died down after this. But unfortunately, they haven't actually, I don't think anybody's actually addressed these direct arguments for intelligent design. I know we're just about ready to finish up here. They talk about two things. Dembski's book says that natural information can be specified. In other words, you can say what the information is. You can figure it out. It can also be complex. In other words, it can be complicated. But if it's both specified and complex, that requires design. And the whole book is about information theory. And if any of you are into that, it's a pretty interesting read. And it's all about how things in biology get the information that they get. And I think that's actually a pretty good argument. So it's an interesting read. The other thing is what they call irreducible complexity.
Under the microscope, bacteria powered by flagella seem almost acrobatic. They tumble, corkscrew, and pirouette, thanks to that whip-like filament. Driving
You've seen this before.
is a tiny motor, part of a complex structure made of about 40 different kinds of proteins.
The bacterial flagellum looks like a sort of Jules Verne notion of what the future looks like. It has a strange sort of mechanical quality to it, these sort of cogs and waving tails and stuff.
And according to Behe, if any one of these parts is missing from the system, the motor can't function. Behe calls systems like this irreducibly complex, a term he coined. And he argues such systems could not have evolved naturally.
The idea is that there are certain aspects of life, perhaps organisms or organs or even cells, that in a sense could only have come about as a whole. In other words, it was very unlikely they could have come about through just a kind of contingent combination of parts over even millions or billions of years, but rather in a sense had to be created whole cloth all together at once, because everything fits together so well that to remove one part, the thing wouldn't function.
Okay, so that's in a nutshell what intelligent design is. But again, you notice that it had to be created all at once, and it had to appear all at once with no dependencies or no stepwise progression. And that's actually where this argument kind of breaks down, is that how is that different from special creation in any other way? And what happens to it is it falsifiable. If you say that God created it, well, and then somebody comes along and explains a stepwise mechanism for that, does that mean God didn't create it? No. It just means that God was an agent of its creation rather than directly creating it specially. It means that it's the old bricklayer versus the architect argument again. So it's 12:15, and we'll hang it up for this week. There's a lot to go through. I'm going to try to maybe start off at this point next week, and then we can talk about how man fits into this, about how human evolution fits in. Anyway, thanks for your input, and I hope you found this interesting. And I will post some good information online, and also feel free to contact me on Facebook. I'm on 2Gab's group, and post any questions there. I love to talk about this stuff, as you can tell.